Hello everybody, welcome to Digital Hammurabi. I think I've successfully unmuted myself and our lovely guest Rosie, so there should be no problems hearing us. I am Megan, for those of you who have not been here before, hello and welcome. And today we're talking to the lovely Rosie, who is an archaeology PhD student at the University of Manchester and has very kindly agreed to come and talk to us about her master's and her PhD research, which I'm excited about, and she has a presentation and everything, so this is going to be good. So, Rosie, hello. How are you?
Hello. I'm good. It's been a lazy weekend.
Oh, I love lazy weekends. They're the best. Do you want to start by giving us a bit of background about yourself and how you got into archaeology?
Yeah. So, oh wow, that's an interesting question, and it's kind of a really odd one for me as well because I always loved history as a kid.
Mm-hmm.
And I grew up in the Lake District, which is so chock full of archaeology.
Oh, the Lake District is amazing.
However, I did not engage with any of that archaeology when I was growing up. And then I kind of forgot that I loved history and stuff. So I went to uni. I studied Arabic for a year and a bit.
Oh, wow.
And I was on my year abroad in Morocco, and we went to these Roman ruins. I think they were called Volubilis, and they were massive and amazing. And I was like, oh my God, this is what I should be doing. And I was already at that point, I was really sick of learning a language. I didn't find it exciting or interesting for me. And I was terrible at grammar and everything. And,
oh my God, as an Assyriologist, I am the world's worst philologist and grammarian. Nope.
Yeah, it's because I never really learned it in school, so I didn't understand the concept of it for so long.
It's a weird thing about British schools. You don't have formal grammatical education.
You don't. You really don't.
I mean, I know what nouns and verbs and adjectives are, but that's about it.
Yeah, same. Yeah, so I was there and I was like, oh God. And then I dropped out, flew home, and then I had 10 months off. And when I got home, my mum was like, you got to clear out your room. There's too much stuff in here. So when I was clearing out my room, I found all of these childhood diaries. And at the in the start of them, it's always what's your favorite food? What's your time of day? Want to be when you grow up? And in there was 2 or 3 of them, and in all of them I'd written archaeologist. And I was like, well,
maybe
I need to go get a degree and I want to move out because I'm already sick of living back at home. So let's have a look what this is about. And I was like, okay, this sounds interesting. And I just kind of
fell into it. That's fantastic.
And then I just ended up falling in love with it and decided to collect all of the degrees, apparently. So yeah, it's a really unconventional story, but I like it because I'm so lucky.
Yes.
Yeah, so I think that's it. And then I fell in love with Near Eastern stuff. I've always been really interested in the Middle East, and I think from day one I was yeah, Near Eastern stuff. But I enjoyed a lot of stuff on the Mycenaeans in Greece, and I dug in Cyprus a couple of times, so I was really into that. And then my undergrad dissertation was actually on Levantine archaeology. And I think I just slowly moved east because by the end of my undergrad, I was I am sick of the Levant. I'm going to go to Mesopotamia.
Move over one.
And I've just ended up here. And yeah, it's really good.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
That's a good story. I like that. It's
an interesting one.
I came to Assyriology via a jewellery degree at Birmingham, and much like you, I got a year and a half through and thought,
yeah,
I like it, but it's not, this isn't me, and switched to ancient history, and actually wanted to be a classicist, but then discovered that there's a whole load of really fascinating stuff from Mesopotamia that people don't know about. So
yeah, even the classical period in Mesopotamia is really obvious. Well, that's not what I do, and I know very, very little about it, but it's just really interesting because you kind of don't think that it's going to be there, and it is, and you're oh, this is cool.
Yeah. This is just such a long historical record that is, I mean, not unbroken in terms of every single location, but that whole area just from Neolithic onwards is absolutely fascinating.
I know, like Neolithic, though even now I'm like, ooh, let's learn about the Paleolithic.
Why not?
Why not? But that's me. When I'm bored, I procrastinate with other archaeology.
At least it's relevant procrastination. You could legitimately call that career development.
No, I'm going to start saying that.
It's not procrastinating. It's career development.
Excellent.
Okay, well, do you want to give like a brief overview of what your research is on, or do you want to just dive into the presentation?
I'll give a vague overview just because it might be confusing if I just throw everything straight in. So I did the crazy thing of going from undergrad to master's to PhD with no break. Don't ask me why. It was just something I did. So when I was at the start of my master's degree, I was like, okay, I need to start thinking about PhDs. I wanted to look at, I've always really been fascinated by architecture, and I love looking at any kind of floor plan, as I'm sure a lot of people will back up. And I wanted to think of like a new way to look at buildings. And my undergrad dis, which was on Levantine fortifications, so I'd already gotten myself into a bit of an architecture hole, and I really loved it. But one thing that I didn't like about a lot of the scholarship surrounding Mesopotamian architecture, urban architecture, was that it's very much divided between monumental and domestic, and it's like and that bothered me because I'm like, I wouldn't, if you like wander around a city today, you've got everything's mixed together. And if you look at like neighborhood plans from like for example, you see like a bakery, a scribal school, a little temple, a couple shrines, you've got, and like houses all around them. And I was like, we need to be looking at this differently. We need to see this as like an urban environment rather than just like two
discrete
very
categories,
distinct different categories where not everything falls into that. And then I read Mary Shepperson's Sunlight and Shade in the First Cities.
I'm glad you said that because we have already a question asking what you think of her work, so we'll get to that later.
Honestly, love it. Read the whole book cover to cover, and I was like, this is amazing. This is so cool. I've never seen anything like this before. So then I was like,
I'm not familiar with it. What, very, very briefly, what is she looking at?
So she basically looks at, I'll see if I can read the blurb so I don't have to.
Lovely.
So it's all about kind of like, it's hard to explain actually. So she looks at light and sunlight and shade as like, like cultural and physical phenomena, which affects like usability of space and, comfort, because, when it's hot, you want to be in the shade. When it's cold, you want to be in the sun. And we'll get into this a bit more with my little presentation. So I read her book, and she says in like the introduction or like the foreword that she was inspired by doing some work in Turkey, and when like doing like artifact drawings, and every so often throughout the day you'd move your table to be around the shade. And then she started like thinking about how this would have happened back then. So I was like looking at this and I was like, this is amazing. And I thought, how can I do something like this but take it a bit of a step further? And that's where I kind of ended up, just in the whole arena of sensory archaeology. So kind of in short, what my research is on is like kind of a new analysis of Mesopotamian urban environments with like sensory archaeology, but also like looking at stuff like the climate and temperatures and weather patterns and stuff like that.
That's fascinating.
So that's how I ended up doing that. Yeah. I honestly didn't realize how big it was until I started doing it, and then I ignore how big it is so I don't freak out. And then I remember how big it is and I freak out. And it's like this consistent process where I'm like, oh, it's fine. But yeah. So yeah, Mary Shepperson's very amazing and influential. And I had a great time when I was like working with her in Iraq last year. It was wonderful. But yeah, shall I get into?
Yes, please. If you get your presentation up, then I will
going.
switch over.
Do I just press share? There we go. There we go. Oh, I think that works. No, there we go. Yep. And I hope that's
perfect.
Okay, so I'm going to be reading off just like the script that I use when I've presented this before. So sorry if it's like
no, please do. I'm going to say quickly, if anyone has any questions for Rosie, please put them in the chat and tag me, and we will save them for the end. But go for it. Questions are good.
So yeah, so this presentation is the preliminary stage of my research, which focuses mainly on my master's thesis. And this was used as a springboard into my PhD project, using like the same research questions and theories surrounding experience and sensory archaeology relating specifically to the first complex urban sites that evolved in Mesopotamia. So I'm first going to talk a bit about the overall natural environment of Mesopotamia and why this ties into my work on the human experience of urban environments. So before I delve into everything, here's a quick background. I'm going to just quickly run through this because this is literally what you guys do. Mesopotamia, it's located in the Middle East, comprising of Iraq, Kuwait, Eastern Syria, and Southeastern Turkey. It's characterized by the two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. And my research is focused on southern Mesopotamia, which is found in southern Iraq. And the first city is often said to have been Uruk, which you can see somewhere down the south in the map. So here's a table showing the middle chronology for the 4th and 3rd millennium BC in Mesopotamia. So the Uruk period is attributed to having the rise of urbanism around 3500 BC at the site of Uruk. And the focus of this research and presentation, however, is on the early dynastic period, where urbanism is seen to be more widespread throughout the Mesopotamian region. So I can spend a lot of time describing the environment in Mesopotamia, but the two main aspects I've picked up from both research and the couple months I spent there last year is that it's dramatic and variable. This is evidenced by people having to adapt themselves to the seasonal cycles, the little quirks that an environment such as this can throw at you. And so here's a table showing the mean high and low temperatures of Nasiriyah, which is a modern day city in southern Iraq closest to Ur. And as we can see, there's 2 out of the 4 seasons that take prevalence here, summer and winter. And even then, it's summer a lot more than it is winter. Mm-hmm. The yearly temperatures are massively variable, especially when you start to look at the highs and the lows rather than the means. So here's the rainfall for the year, once again for Nasiriyah. So in June, July, August, and September, there's like no rain whatsoever. So following on from September is when the rainy seasons start and the millimeters of rain start climbing up. So when complex urban sites started to develop and grow, there was a new environment for people to interact with. This, however, did not negate or change the natural environment. And my first question was, how did people adapt to this new way of living? But how did this combine and work with the natural environment? Hello.
Yes. Okay. Sorry, everyone. That was my fault. Could you
Do you want me to go back?
Just one slide. That would be great.
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you. Sorry, everyone.
No, it's all right. So here's some more images. Here's some images of the varied environment. And all of these were taken within a 2-month period in the same area. So as you can see, it can appear very different throughout a short period of time. And here's some more pictures of the varied landscape. The most notable being that December mist. And that's my supervisor disappearing into the mist. Sometimes this winter mist was like so intense that you couldn't see 10 meters in front of you. But after a while, it'd clear up and just feel like a summer's day.
Wow.
So with the variability of the landscape covered, so this led me to the questions I posed earlier. How did people experience the first urban centers in Mesopotamia? So my first port of call was to investigate through a single site for my master's thesis, and I selected the site of 𝀭. Also, I'm still never sure how to pronounce it, so sorry. If someone thinks I've got it wrong, I will agree with you. So 𝀭is located in the Diyala province of Iraq, and the site was originally excavated by Chicago's Oriental Institute, starting in 1930. So while geographically isolated from southern Mesopotamia, the Diyala is believed to be central to the development of complex societies and very much a part of the Sumerian world in the 3rd millennium BC. Once again, here's a map showing Mesopotamia and sites of significance. You can see the Diyala just like kind of to the left of where modern Baghdad is. And then this is a detail map showing the Diyala sites excavated by the OI in the 30s. And while the Diyala can be seen as geographically removed, there's still a strong concentration of urban sites located there. The site of 𝀭was selected because of the architectural remains excavated and the recording. And the study area chosen was a good example of a built urban environment, as public and monumental architecture was found to be alongside housing and possible neighborhoods. So here's the study area. And this area was located on Mound A of the site. This is my re-digitization of the excavation ground plan to just make it easier to use. So we've got the temple oval. As you can see, it's a massive building. And you can see the housing and the neighborhoods clustered around it, with some even built to adhere to the curve of the wall, as you see in the top left. So starting from the point of my research questions, I then had to decide how to best approach this. I was limited in scope with it being my master's thesis, so I had to choose the most efficient way to apply my thoughts. I did this through a combination of phenomenology and sensory archaeology. I also wanted to keep the focus on the landscape and climate rooted within it, hence why I focused part on climate and seasonality. However, I was only able to cover the height of summer and the height of winter. One available form of analysis for a project such as this is shadow casting. So I employed the methodology of 𝀭, which is shown in these diagrams. However, this meant that I did have to estimate the building heights. So for the residential buildings, I decided on 2.65 meters in height, as this is the excavated ceiling height for a number of residential structures at Ur. And for the temple oval, the isometric reconstruction, which you saw on the cover slide, showed the inner wall to be higher than the outer. So while still speculative, I decided to stay within that assumption and just arbitrarily chose the heights of 4 and 5 meters for the outer and inner walls respectively, because it was like a proof of concept more than a serious, we're doing this study. So for the shadow casting, I chose 1 day from summer and 1 day from winter, and selected the 3 best times of day to exemplify the daily changes, and they were 8 a.m., 12 p.m. and 4 p.m. And the analysis of smell and sounds used in the dissertation was purely speculative. inferring practices such as the making and burning of dung cakes or incense or religious practices, to how this could have made the settlement smell and sound in different ways. I also looked at a number of aspects of Mesopotamian life, such as festivals, music, and population size, as these all affect the experience of living in a place. So, climate was my starting point in the analysis. So, as I said, the climate of Mesopotamia is very complex and variable, and it's classed as a semi-arid region. So, in the summer, the average temperatures range from the late 20s to the 40s, with the most extreme temperatures occurring around midday when the sun's elevation is greater than 80%. As Shepperson says, this is highly uncomfortable for human life. And with there being approximately 14 hours of daylight in the summer, there would have been enough time in the day to take advantage of the cooler temperatures of early morning and later afternoon or evening to avoid the heat of the day. The lack of rainfall in the summer would also have contributed to the harshness of the climate on the Mesopotamian plain, and would have also posed a constraint on daily life, especially with water laws being introduced at the end of the 3rd millennium BC, controlling the access to what was and still is a very limited source. So, winter, as a surprise, is in contrast to summer in southern Iraq, with temperatures being between 10 to 20 degrees with an average of 12 to 29 millimeters of rainfall. Winter also brings about a number of different weather types not really experienced in summer, like crazy rainfall, that mad mist where you couldn't see anything, and really quite frequent and very, very dramatic thunderstorms. So in the summer, when the heat of the sun was to be avoided at all costs, it's plausible that people would have altered their routines to conduct any outdoor activities in the sun, probably around midday when the temperature was at its warmest. So to back up these assumptions, I then completed the shadow casting. There we go. So this is the shadow plan for 8 a.m. in midsummer. So almost the entirety of the temple is covered by shade at this time, providing a thermally comfortable environment for those within. At this time, the housing in the area would also have been entirely cast in shade. So now here's the plan for midday in summer. And this shows the drastic contrast. So the strong sunlight conditions are clearly heightened throughout the lack of shade, and you'd want to avoid them. So the effect of the sunlight conditions at this time are summed up by Shepperson. Instead of creating and making space usable, it instead renders space unusable and is therefore space consuming. This shows the plausibility of people avoiding the midday heat in favour of the more shaded mornings and afternoons. So this is the plan for 4 p.m. in summer. As you can see, it's a similar amount of shade to 8 a.m., but just in the opposite direction. At this time, a significant portion of the courtyard would be in direct sunlight. And once again, the houses are almost entirely in shade, suggesting that they were maybe constructed to be in the shadow of the temple, which has been exemplified at other Mesopotamian sites such as 𝀭, and 𝀭. So with the houses also built back to back and in a compacted layout, the combined surface area is reduced, which lessens the solar exposure, providing more thermal comfort for the residents. Sunlight and shadow would therefore have changed the way people moved throughout and interacted with the urban environment in summer, like staying in the shade as the sun is too hot. And another consideration for this is shoes. There's little evidence of shoes in the archaeological record for Mesopotamia, and most of these are reed or leather sandals. So if one were wearing no shoes or shoes with very little sole protection, you'd need to stay in the shade so as to not burn the soles of your feet, like you always do on the beach when it's too hot.
Like walking on hot tarmac.
Yeah, and you're on the beach and you're running to the sea, so that's another thing that I hadn't even thought of that, and someone suggested it to me, and I was like, oh wow. So one interesting experiential observation that I made with this plan is, so the stairs to the platform in the temple are shaded.
Oh, that is interesting.
And so while most of the platform itself is in sunlight, so this could have had a very dramatic effect if someone was ascending the staircase, transitioning from the shade into the sunlight and into the sunlight of the platform. And this could potentially have been for more like drama. So now moving on to the shadows for winter in January, which is usually the coldest month in Iraq. So here's the plan for 8 a.m. As we can see, it's much more dramatic than the morning one for summer, with all of the northeastern section of the study area covered in shadow. So with average temperatures in January at 10 degrees, it can be assumed that the mostly outdoor and exposed temple would not have been a preferable place to be at 8 a.m. And the same goes for the streets surrounding the temple and the housing. Moving on to midday, as we can see, the shade is much less dramatic, with some pockets of sunshine having appeared. At this time of day, entering the temple itself would have been an interesting transition, with the small strip of sunlight sat by the entrance, however surrounded by shade. There we go. Finally, here's the shadows for 4 p.m. in winter, which is just dramatic as winter at 8 a.m. Once again, there's the strip of sunlight mentioned. However, it now leads almost to the secondary entrance to the temple there, and therefore could create an interesting experience entering the outer temple and being bathed in sun as you walk to the secondary entrance, and then entering the darkened roofed room, and then back out into the shaded temple courtyard. At all the times of day shown for winter, almost all of the residential structures lie in either the direct shadow of the temple or that of structures nearby, possibly making the residential area feel quite colder in winter. However, the compact layout of these once again works as an advantage, probably keeping them feeling slightly warmer. Yeah. Once again, it can be assumed here that the behavior of sun and shadows plays into the way people interacted with and moved through the urban environment. However, this time staying in the sun to keep oneself thermally comfortable, and possibly once again to protect their feet, but from the cold. So this gets me to the other arenas of sensory perception used, the first of which being smell. There's a number of contributing factors to the overall smellscape of the study area, and I'm just going to quickly go through them, as it's like much harder to discuss these comprehensively without a greater deal of research and fieldwork and experimentation. So the first of these is Mesopotamian religious practices, which involved animal sacrifice, feasts and festivals. Incense was also burned at a number of religious events. Cooking throughout the whole environment, brewing and processing also contributed to this, as did the creation and use of dung cakes as fuel. Waste management and sanitation is also a consideration for smell within the city, with McMahon outlining that people often avoided certain areas of the city and also areas of water due to the smell, especially that of unclean water and also waterborne diseases. And finally, wind direction is important to consider, as wind can easily carry smells a limited distance. And more testing is needed to see how far, but it's worth thinking about anyway. So the prevailing wind direction at 𝀭is northwest, and therefore a number of the smells created in the temple could have carried somewhat possibly into a portion of the residential areas. This may or may not have been intentional, but it's just an interesting thing to see. So the possibilities of sound within the built environment of 𝀭relate to a number of things, such as crafting and the performances of lamentations and emisal prayers within the temple, religious festivals and processions, which possibly also included instruments, and also the general noise and hustle and bustle of human life, or lack of, if an afternoon siesta was observed, would add to the experience, particularly poignantly if many disappeared into their houses for a few hours in the afternoon. So overall, doing this as my master's dissertation with the aim to then take it further with my PhD was a good undertaking. And the main thing I took from it was that the sensory experiences of living in urban sites in Mesopotamia were much more complex than I'd originally thought. The sensory experience of living within one of these urban environments could also have been overstimulating for some, possibly similar to how life can be for some, including myself, like today. Going back to my central questions, I found that the first cities obviously changed the way people led their lives, and that the natural environment and the urban environment have to be considered together, as they did shape people's lives differently in a number of ways. There were also numerous new sensory and multisensory experiences to be had, with the urban environment bringing these about. And the urban environment was indeed experienced differently at different times of day and different times of year, which also leads into people using and utilizing space in a number of different ways throughout the days and the seasons. So in order to more comprehensively understand the complex sensorial experience of living within these urban centres, a large variety of variables need to be analysed. So in part, this work, my master's thesis, did so, attempting to understand and analyse how all of the factors mentioned worked together to create the experience of this environment. However, in order to delve deeper into this, more work needs to be done, particularly considering lifestyle, sound and smell. And this is where I intend to, and am taking it further with my research, where I've been creating virtual 3D reconstructions of Mesopotamian urban environments and applying sensory variables to them, and also conducting fieldwork and experimental archaeology in order to gain more understanding of the factors that can't be simulated, such as smell, lifestyle, and the noise of human life. And that is my presentation.
Wonderful, thank you very much.
There's a bibliography if anybody wants it. But if anybody wants the bibliography, I can just send them the presentation or something.
Rosie's Twitter handle is in the link
yes.
The link to Rosie's Twitter handle is in the description of the video.
Wonderful.
So if you have questions for her, if you want to see her bibliography, you can find her on Twitter.
Yeah.
So go for it.
And I'm happy to email people like any of my work to read or anything. I've not published anything, but if someone wants to read my master's thesis, feel free. Like, it was a pain in the neck. Like, I'll just be happy that someone reads it.
Someone somewhere is reading it. Yep.
Yeah. And then I have a bit more to talk on in general. Like, I've been developing my theoretical framework recently, and that is not what I was looking for. I was trying to open it and I couldn't find it. I've been generally looking at my theoretical framework and looking at new ways and new theories to apply to what I'm thinking, because my second supervisor is really down with theory. And at one point she mentioned like, but this is this, because, and then like explained it to me perfectly, and I was like, oh, and I didn't even really realize. So it was quite interesting. Let's see if there it is. I wrote notes, but I hid them somewhere, as always. So my theoretical framework is actually getting bigger and bigger. I thought it was just going to be a simple like, phenomenology, sensory archaeology. But then when I was researching and writing for my literature review last summer, I kind of got really frustrated with so many of the things that I was like reading, because they all focus on stuff like social, and they're like, and I have no issue with that, but I'm like, but what about the buildings? So let's try and think how to word this. So I believe there was like a distinct gap within the scholarship of general Mesopotamian urban environments. And I was frustrated with the consistent separation, like I said, of dualism of monumental and domestic, with all too much focus. So, and I also got so annoyed with like the distinct focus on the social, the human, the anthropocentric way of looking at urban environments and architecture. And this is how I've kind of arrived, I think, at some kind of new materialist stance, engaging with post-humanist and non-anthropocentric approaches, specifically...
Kind of like object agency for buildings.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm like really into I'm not that down with agency yet, but I'm really into the idea of building agency. I think it's like, yes, power to the buildings. But I also, so I've been influenced a lot by my second supervisor, who is good friends with Rachel Corellian at Leicester, and I've read some of Rachel's work, and that's just like, it like opened my eyes, because as well, a lot of theoretical stuff is written and like just what I feel like just put through a thesaurus, engaging with that, whereas Rachel writes so clearly, and I really like it. So then I also began to consider assemblage theory after looking more closely into the archaeological like scholarship of neighborhoods, particularly Stone's Nipper neighborhoods, and the AH site at which is the beautiful excavated big one. And with both of these, I began to see like ever-changing fluid, like this ever-changing fluid dynamic nature in the neighborhoods.
They don't stay still.
They really don't. And I've been doing some research into like, it sounds real boring, but it gets more exciting, architectural details. So I've been pouring through excavation reports, highlighting every instance of the word door, window, stairs. Not very fun to do. But doing this, I realized that like, especially at it's like, oh, this door was here, and then it moved here, and then it moved here. And then when I thought, I was like, that's so weird. That's so strange. And then I was like, oh, but mud brick is so malleable. You can just change it. You can just cut out a door shape, fill in the old door shape with that, and put the door there. So you can't see this from static ground plans. So this is when I began to understand mud brick as a material much more deeply. And I realized that I was rooted in a very westernized perception of buildings in general, which are most of the time literally set in stone.
They stay where they are.
They stay.
Door is where the door is, and if you don't like it, well then
that's that. Sorry. Yeah. So mud brick's so malleable and changeable. And because you've got to maintain it a lot, some days you might be like, oh, well, I've just got to do this wall. Oh, let's have a window, and as the neighborhood, I haven't fully like looked into more of this, but I was thinking that as the neighborhood like changes around like the structures, of course the structures are going to have to alter the way they like enter the house, because if a building comes up next to them and their door's there, they don't want to be right there. They want to move it here. So I also explored like relational approaches, such as like Latour's actor network theory. And I like it, but I find issue with the notion of when one actant changes, a whole new network emerges, because no, that's not how I see it. So that's how I settled on assemblage theory. And it's useful. I think it's my best, like the best bet for this. And especially because it's a useful way to perceive change.
Could you take, just 2 seconds and explain what assemblage theory is? Because I strongly suspect a lot of people watching have no idea what you're talking about.
So, so assemblage theory is basically, in essence, like everything's an assemblage. And, this book is an assemblage of paper, thread, whatever they make the hardback cover of, ink, stuff like that. But then if I rip out a page, according to actor network theory, it's a whole new network. Whereas this changes, it's just, the assemblage just changes with it, if that kind of makes sense. So, it's like really hard to explain.
Is it kind of looking at, especially with archaeology, looking at things that were grouped together, used together, the relationship between all the different things, and then how that relates to the space of the house and then the space of the city, and
basically, and like everything's an assemblage, and like one thing can be in a small assemblage but also be in a bigger assemblage. So you've got like a house, and that's an assemblage of walls, doors, stairs, and then you've got a neighborhood, and that's an assemblage of all of that, and then you've got a whole city, and that's
But you can also have a jar buried in the ground full of jewellery, and that jar and the jewellery is itself an assemblage, even though it's contained within the house, within the neighbourhood, within the city.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm pretty sure that's basically it. I'm terrible at explaining things.
So good.
If someone thinks I'm wrong, tell me. Or if you think I'm right, that's also nice. But yeah, so but yeah, that's basically it. Because no urban environment is static. Unlike the excavation plans I spend like most of my life just staring at. Mm-hmm. It's not static. That's the culmination of a lot of excavation, and it's usually multi-period. Mm-hmm. And while I do enjoy the like the 3D reconstructions, I do think that there is, probably shouldn't be saying this on the internet, but I do think there is an issue in presenting them as they are. There is an issue with presenting them because they are a representation of a static period. Mm-hmm. But I'm also going to carry on doing it anyway, because it's the best bet to see how these things like kind of looked. Mm-hmm. And yeah, that's
fascinating.
Basically what I do, kind of, I think. I'm never sure. No, it changes every day, I feel.
It does. That's the joy of being an academic.
Yes.
Well, thank you. That was very informative and very interesting. We have several questions.
That's cool.
We had also one emailed in before the show even began from a regular viewer who can't make it to the live view, but wanted to ask you a question. So this is LT Galloway.
I'm also just going to say, before we go with the questions, I am pretty bad at thinking off the top of my head. So if I don't answer a question in the way that you wanted, or you think I didn't answer it and I just rambled, just harass me on Twitter and I'll sort it. I'll figure it out. I'm like way better written.
Yeah, I am too sometimes.
Yeah.
But he says, do you agree with Dr. Mary Shepperson in that, quote, it is tempting to suggest that the convention of diagonal street orientation originated early in the development of Mesopotamian urbanism as the optimal solution for the layout of streets and buildings with respect to the sun. The early temples followed the orientation of the streets, and this orientation thus gained a symbolic or ideological value.
Wow. I think I've read all of Mary's work as well, so I do recognise it. Mm-hmm. I inherently agree, but we can't know for sure.
It's not a provable thing, yeah.
It's not a provable thing, but the way I see it is these people lived in this crazy, crazy environment, mm-hmm. and obviously cities, once again, weren't built in a day, mm-hmm. but it does appear that sometimes people had a bit more like agency and say in how like specific neighborhoods were built when they were, depending on the site and the neighborhood and who it was and everything. So it is entirely plausible that someone was like, oh, let's avoid that sun. Mm. What was the rest of the quote?
And the orientation of the street then led to the orientation of the temple. And then because that was the orientation of the temple, that came to be viewed as like a symbolically religious
that's
orientation.
Interesting. I mean, well, we don't know, do we?
Maybe.
Yeah. There was like a bit of an obsession with like symmetry, mm-hmm. I think. Yeah, there was. And, it could be construed that because they just wanted everything to be like along that line, I think. I'm not sure.
Don't worry.
That's worry. Cool.
Nope, that was a good question though. Thank you.
It's a very good question. I really like it. Thank you for just asking it. That was amazing.
So we have a question from your biggest fan, who is a gentleman named Dan Luby.
Yes. Hi, Dan.
Says, do you plan to use any ethnographic work to assess how modern urbanism differs to ancient urbanism?
I'm going to touch on it, but it's not going to be like a big part of this already too large PhD. But it is something that I think about doing a lot because, when you're doing this kind of like academic stuff like full time, you can't ever really switch it off. Mm-hmm. So I'll be wandering around town thinking like, oh, I wonder. I'm in the shadow. This is nice, but I do. I am going to be looking at ethnographic. Oh, well, I have read quite a bit of ethnographic stuff, but not about the ethnography, but about the ethnographer's experience of going to Mesopotamia. Mm-hmm. So I was reading a book about a guy who was in Mesopotamia doing some ethnography. Book was a bit dodgy in general, but he talks about how like horrible and hot it was, mm-hmm. and how he got sunburned all the time. So I'm touching on those kind of things. Mm-hmm. But as in general, no, that's a project for later.
Not in this particular project.
Yeah, that's a project for later. And Dan, you want to help me? You're always welcome.
So we have a question from Bob Smith who says, what new technologies were developed to make urban living functional?
I mean, well, like material culture is not my thing really, but the one thing that's coming straight to mind, but that isn't making it functional, but it's the bevel rim bowls, mm-hmm. from the Uric period, which I like to see them as like the first ever Tupperware, because they all stack so
There's enough
neatly.
Of them.
There's too many. But they kind of show like the rationing process, because people were working, I assume, building the cities, and they use the bevel rim bowls as like to fill in rations, I think. Once again, if I'm wrong, let me know, because this is not what I'm thinking. New technologies. I mean, we got farming, mm-hmm. which led to sedentary life. And I think if there was a big change, because I feel like it was a very, not spontaneous, but a very gradual people just moving a bit closer mm-hmm. to the centre. Because although it is, I guess farming could be the answer, because one of the biggest things was the surplus,
mm-hmm. well,
to then pay and redistribute. So, yeah. And then you could have craft specializations and stuff, mm-hmm. I think.
But you couldn't have all of that stuff. No. You couldn't have all of that stuff without the farming surplus.
No, yeah, the farming. So I guess farming, mm-hmm.
as
much as it's the most generic and annoying archaeological answer that you're going to get. Like,
yeah. Farming,
but yeah, farming.
Canal digging.
Oh, the canal digging.
Oh, so many canals.
So many. Yeah, I think that's it. Yeah.
Good answer. Mrs. Jesser, what kind of animals did early cities have, both domesticated and wild urban life? And second question, were the first cities as culturally diverse as we see in Alexandria in later time periods?
Okay, so animals. I know that there are some form of cattle. I don't know the exact species, but cattle were knocking about. They would frequently be in a pasture outside the city. So I'm just going to turn my desk light off because it's shining in my eyes. They were frequently left like outside the city, and then they were brought in before they were killed, mm-hmm. Or used to sacrifice or to feed the god. Mm-hmm. And I think, well, there's water buffalo in Iraq for mm-hmm. sure, but I don't know what anybody did with them. And then there's little things like, well, is it rabbits? I don't think it's rabbits.
I don't know.
Oh, I'm not sure.
I think sheep goats, and pigs.
Especially sheep, goats,
so
pigs.
Many sheep.
I know that the cattle are, I think they're a smaller breed than what you'd see in like the UK or the US or the general Western world. But yeah, there's cattle, there's sheep.
Donkeys.
Donkeys, yeah.
Horses later.
Horses were later when they got them from wherever.
Yes.
But that was like the animals that were in the cities. What was the question again? Dogs, yeah, there will have been dogs. Don't know what they would do. Lions were knocking around.
Yeah, hippos.
Because we know that Ashurbanipal loved a good lion killing.
And there were elephants, Syrian elephants.
Yes!
Again, not in the cities. Just have to emphasize, not elephants wandering through the cities. But
that would be amazing if they were, though.
Very cool. You find an extra wide street and people are puzzling about what this is for, and then you realise, oh, it's the Elephant Highway.
It's the Elephant Street. That would have been great. I think that's about it. Once again, I'm not a zoo archaeologist.
No, that's a specific field in and of itself.
Yeah. But I think that's about it. I know that like when specific temples needed to like feed the god, which was just like feeding the statue. I really don't know how that worked, but there was specific animals for each specific god. But I can't remember who was who, but it was like, a cattle for, I can't think of any Mesopotamian gods, but you know what I mean.
Yeah. Thank you.
What's
And
the part?
the second part were the first cities as culturally diverse as we see in Alexandria in later periods. That's difficult.
I doubt
to
it.
say. Yes, probably.
It's difficult to say.
There's evidence in or for people, either the presence of people from the Indus Valley or trade with the Indus Valley. But
there was trade.
Yeah, whether they were actually there is more difficult.
And I know that, you got immigrants, or, well, you don't really they're more like war prisoners that they dragged back, which is not a good idea. But there would have been other cultures, but not as culturally. But I also don't know much about Alexandria, so
yeah,
I know there was a big library. But I would doubt it in the third millennium. So like hang on, what's the third millennium? Yeah, 3000 to 2000 BC. But I know that once you get into the second millennium,
you have trading
and
colonies,
then
and
you have a bit more, and then in the first millennium you've got loads, and then you've got other stuff in other areas of the Near East going on, where like the Hittites would just drag people back and stuff. But yeah, I'm not entirely sure.
So Bob Smith is asking if you're saying that the climate in that region now is the same as it would have been back then.
Obviously, we have had climate change, which let's not get into. So the data that I showed is the oldest data I could find for Iraq, which was 1940s, 1950s. Obviously, it's still going to be inherently different to 3000 BC, because there is also I read somewhere where someone was saying that like climate change started within the Iron Age. So obviously it's going to be different, and we're not 100% sure how different, but I would assume it's like not too far away.
And the landscape at the very least is not far and away massively different.
No, it's not really. I mean, there's like little things like the banks of the Tigris and the Euphrates used to have palm trees and stuff all over them, and now they don't. But that's just like modern building and stuff. But yeah, I think it is different, but we don't know how much. I'm operating on the assumption that it isn't very different, but it's a little bit.
Yeah, and with work like that, really the best you can do is just use the data that you have available and acknowledge that it's not perfect, but it's the closest you can get.
Because if I could get my hands on some 3rd millennium BC temperature data, that would be fantastic.
And actually, related question from another of your biggest fans, Melissa Taylor, says, have you come across any material evidence of ancient weather recording?
No. No, I have not. Although that would be so cool.
That would be amazing.
I mean, there's things in like poems. So that is one thing I am going to be doing at some point when I find the time. I'll be looking at textual stuff. So there's some like poems where it's like, I sat in the shade of the tree and that was nice. But that's not really weather recording. But it is noting how you feel about the environment. which I liked. There's a few more that I cannot remember off the top of my head. But yeah, not really. If there are, someone needs to tell me.
I don't know about...
Because there's astronomy and stuff, but that's first mill, really, isn't it?
It's all of the things that I can think of are far too late to be probably of much use.
Although it might be interesting to just look at anyway. I'm going to write this down. Thanks, Melissa.
And if you message me on Twitter, I have a couple of people who might be able to suggest things for you.
That would be amazing.
Of course. So Milton asks, what do you think is the best referencing software?
None of them. You just do it by yourself. Obviously. That is actually how I do it. It takes me longer to actually do referencing software than it would for me to just write
the references yourself.
I have Manchester Harvard so down now that it's just like imprinted in my brain.
By the time I left Birmingham, I did my undergraduate and my master's degree there. By the time I left, I had Chicago referencing. I could do it in my sleep. And now I can't because it's been so long. But I used to be able to. I'm just scrolling down to see if we have more questions. Mrs. Jess again. How much time did people spend inside?
Once again, we don't know. I'm assuming in the winter more than the summer. There's evidence for people cooking inside. There's evidence for people cooking outside. There's evidence for people cooking next to the door outside or next to the door inside. So I'm just using cooking as an example. Yeah, I'm really not sure. That's kind of what I would like to figure out, but obviously it's hard with no time machine. But I would like to assume, well, it depends what the specific person was doing. If they worked in the fields, they would frequently like camp out or like live by the fields for like a month or two and then come back to the city when it was off season. So in that case, not much time. But then obviously you get people who were having children and staying at home to look after the children. This is just an example. I'm not being stereotyping genders. But yeah, I think, I'm not sure because I think it depends. And obviously like you've got houses where it's like the bakery, but also the baker lives there. So if you're doing that, then you're going to be at home a lot. I think it's
a good answer. Thank you. Yeah. If anyone else has questions for Rosie, now is the time. But we've got through all of the ones that I have seen. If I've missed you, I'm very sorry. Please very quickly type it in so I can ask Rosie. While we're waiting to see if there are any questions, I am going to say, for those who have not seen our fundraising video, we are currently fundraising for the Christmas period with some other YouTube creators. We have a charity donation pool. The link is in the description, and we are all raising money for different local charities. Josh and I will be using our money we'll be sending our money to a local charity that operates in Baltimore called Santa Claus Anonymous, that buys Christmas gifts for children who would not otherwise receive anything. So if you have an extra couple of dollars, we'd very much appreciate it. I think we're just over $5,000 now, which is not bad. Very pleased about that. And Miss Jessa just sent us €2. Thank you so much, and says, lots of info I haven't thought about before. Thank you. You are very welcome. Thank you for joining us. We don't appear to have any more questions. So Rosie, do you have anything to add?
Well, thank you for putting out an announcement saying who wants to do this, and thanks to half asleep me being like, I'll do that.
Thank you, half asleep Rosie.
That was, I like regretted it. I was like, oh God, what have I done? It's like I do this thing where I like wake up and I'll go on Twitter for 10 minutes and I'll go back to sleep.
And then you wake up and you think, what happened?
I wake up and I'm like, oh God.
I've just agreed to do an interview on YouTube.
I was real confused because I was like, I didn't remember it, and then I was like, oh no. But no, this has been amazing. Thank
you. Been very enjoyable.
Really, what you guys are doing. I think it's really good.
Thank you very much.
And it's the kind of thing that I feel very passionate about, because I'm very, very sick of academia being such a
closed thing.
Yeah, because like, okay, I might not be the best person at like explaining things, but if anyone ever wants to like ask me what I'm doing or whatever, I'm so happy to explain. And I'm always so happy when I find like academic publications that aren't published in like very stereotypical academic language. I just feel like, well, it's getting more and more open now. I mean, I'm not from like a very privileged background, and I've somehow managed to make it here. But you know, it's still taking a while. And I assume in America it's kind of a bit harder as well. But I just really appreciate this, because also Mesopotamia is so much cooler than Egypt or Greece or Rome. Obviously I'm biased, but like, you know, there's so much stuff out there on like Egypt or Rome, and like the first question people ask me is like, oh, it's not the pyramids, and I'm like,
no.
But I just love Mesopotamia so much. And I'm going to be like forcing my nieces to watch the kids show when you guys release it.
Excellent. That's what I like to hear.
Yeah, just thank you. And thank you to everybody for questions.
We had good questions. And actually we have one last one from Stephanie Wilson, who says, did they have large gardens? Which is a spectacular question. And we know there were in the first millennium.
Yeah, like Neo-Assyrians. I had in my master's, I had the best time because I did a module on Near East, and I was like, well, I'm not going to do early Mesopotamia because I'm going to get sick of that. So I wrote an essay on like the iconography of the chair in Neo-Assyrian wall reliefs. But anyway, that was like, I wish I'd done my PhD on that. No, I'm kidding. But it was fantastic. I love the Neo-Assyrians. Yeah, so you've got gardens in the Neo-Assyrian era. You've got gardens in North Mesopotamia for sure, because it's a different like climate. It's a lot more green there. In southern, well, it depends on what you're classifying as a garden. There are a lot of courtyards. There's lots of open spaces. I don't know if they're particularly green. The riverbanks, if you look at like, you know, like kind of like artists' reconstructions, the riverbanks are like quite green with like trees and stuff, but we're not sure if that's true. But people had outside space. Whether that had like flowers and stuff, I'm not sure, because the site we were on in the Basra province was just like beige. And then like these weird little like succulent bush things started growing every time it rained. They'd get bigger. So there is some like vegetation. I'm not sure. But yeah, there was outside space for sure. And the Neo-Assyrians had some great looking gardens.
And like there are gardens and stuff in poetry and inscriptions, and my son has woken up.
Hello.
Can you say hi to Rosie? Say hi, Rosie.
Hello.
Hi.
I like his dinosaur hoodie. That is fantastic.
What's the dinosaur say?
Yes.
Okay. He's like sliding through the arm of the chair. So that was all questions are done. Thank you everyone for joining us. This was really enjoyable. Thank you, Rosie, again for coming to talk to us.
Thank you for having me.
It's been so fun.
I like that you have a medium for people who are pursuing academic endeavors but aren't necessarily like an academic. Because you had that guy who had just talking about his undergrad dissertation on it, and I was like, oh my god, that's amazing. Because
you don't get the space to really do it and talk about it, and you don't sorry.
No, it's great.
Unless you're in a PhD program and you're being encouraged to publish, there isn't official space to talk about it outside of your like immediate friend group, which is great, but then you don't get to share your enthusiasm with people.
And I just think it's so good. And like, I do not present much. I just like avoid conferences. I haven't been to a conference yet for my PhD. I am going to Bania this year though, but Yeah, no, I just think it's a great medium. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Of course. So I think we will finish there. Everybody, thank you for joining us. And as always, until next time, resist poor scholarship. Always ask,
yes.
How do you know that?